guys, this is another ABentleyMusic tutorial. Today I'm going to be talking about my approach to dialing in some heavy, aggressive bass tones, primarily used for like the harder rock and metal stuff, but I'm sure these principles will apply to anything that requires a driven, aggressive bass tone. The tone I'm going to be chasing, which is what we'll reach at the end of this video, sounds a little something like this. So something really mid-rangey, makes the guitar sound a lot bigger, those sort of characteristics. So let's start with the blank canvas here. I'm going to go ahead and load up my cabinet first. I don't do anything with it except maybe mess with the low and high cut. It's a preference thing, but I feel that I don't need anything below there. And it's obviously not an aggressive low cut. There'll still be some activity below there, but I like to just tame the low end in the cab block. I know I'm not going to need anything over 7K, so I went ahead and took care of that. And then with the amplifier, it's just the SV bass, which is the Ampeg model. I do a little bit of tweaking here just to get the bass a little bit more present and a little bit more full. So right now, without doing anything, the bass sounds like this. So the first thing I'm going to do is turn this bright switch on. Turn my treble up. I always hit the number 6.3 or around there. I like to turn the brightness up along with the bright switch just to really get that high end working. You can really hear the aggression of my picking come out. The mid-range gets a little muddy and honky for me, so I like to get a little bit of that out right at the amplifier. The bass I get all the way up to about 7. Again, personal preference, depends on the behavior of your bass guitar and how you play. Always experiment with these settings. Amp drive, I don't really do anything to that unless it needs to be. 5 just tends to work for me, so let's hear that. So before I go and put that drive pedal in the loop, I'm gonna activate this gate really quick because I know the noise floor is gonna start to increase and I wanna get rid of any of the excess noise right at the beginning of the chain. So now I'm going to throw the drive pedal in parallel so I can get that clean bass sound going into the amp as well as a driven bass sound. It's almost like the equivalent of having 2 tracks, one with high-end content that's distorted and one that's undistorted and has all the bass. So I just want to have 2 different signals and I like to just have it all in one track, so I go ahead and take care of it here. So as for my settings, I like the tone a little bit darker just because this bass doesn't take very well to a high tone. It can sound a little ice picky in my opinion. The drive just a little bit, so get it aggressive but not too much so that you're losing the clarity. And this low cut and high cut, definitely experiment with that. It'll definitely depend on your playing, the genre, and just the bass guitar itself. With this EQ here, I've noticed my bass tends to have a buildup of about 350 once I throw this drive pedal in, so I just yank a little bit of that out right here. And then the treble, I boost just a little bit. Again, it's just an ear thing. Don't worry too much about the numbers. Just listen to the guitar and then just kind of make decisions as to what's needed as you go. So here's the bass guitar with these 4 elements put in. Starting to get more aggressive, but I feel that there's some build-ups in some areas. And before I get into that, I just want to say that I feel that the bass will take more to drastic EQ changes than other instruments. It won't make it sound too unnatural, at least to me, so I'm really not hesitant to take away a large amount of certain frequency bands, just so I can let it sit in the mix the way that it should. With that said, I noticed that with everything together, there starts to be a build-up of about 250-ish. So I take a large amount of that out with a pretty wide bandwidth because I feel like it creates a lot of overtones I'm not a fan of above the fundamental. 8 dB tends to work there. And then also, once I put the drive pedal in, there starts to be this buildup above 1K that I'm not a fan of. So I do the same thing, pretty drastic cut there. So let's hear how this sounds with the EQ put in. less cloudy sounding and a little more focused. So a couple things to point out that are really crucial to getting a good bass sound is your bass guitar and the way that you play it. These are the most important variables in your tone. You need to play with a certain style to achieve a certain sound. In my case, I pick incredibly hard, and this Warwick tends to have a really aggressive mid-range, which is very beneficial to me. So those two variables combined are a huge amount of what makes my tone sound like my tone. It's very important that besides just the amp settings and things like that, you also experiment with the way you play, how aggressively you hit, where exactly on the guitar itself that you're striking the strings. All of these things have a huge effect on the tonality, so I can't stress that enough. I'll start by picking really soft and picking a lot harder so you can hear what I'm talking about. So yeah, you hear it really start to open up and get pretty aggressive just from the way your right hand is laying into it. We're going to go ahead and listen to a snippet of one of my demos with this bass tone in there, and we're just going to hear how the mix sounds. So it's sounding aggressive, but it's not sitting in the mix the way I like, to be honest. There's some things I like to do after the Axe effects to get it to sit a little bit better. I won't go into my specific settings because these are my settings, and it's important that you experiment with your own settings to get your own personalized bass tone. But I hope that these general explanations will be really helpful for you. So I start with a opto-style compressor. In this case, it's the CLA2A. And tends to even things out pretty well as just add a nice character to the low end. But if your bass is pretty dynamic, I would recommend having another compressor with that, one that has a really fast attack that can really tame those peaks and level it out a little bit more aggressively. So another move is my EQ. I'll evaluate the mix. Typically there's guitars already in there, and I'll be asking myself what stands out that I don't like. That's either conflicting with the guitars or the drums or anything else in the mix. I want it to be tamed yet aggressive, so you gotta find those points that could compromise that. And another thing is some multi-band compression. I like to really tackle some mid-range areas, just so that there's not any build-ups in different note regions that can compromise the clarity and interfere with the other instruments. I want to really tame those. So really experiment with multi-band compression. That's a pretty important thing to me, to get that mid-range to be under control and to really interact with the mix in a good way. And then this last thing I like to do is sidechain compression with the kick. My goal is to have a really big drum sound, which usually is the goal. I like to have that kick really come through the bass without having to filter out a bunch of low end in my bass. So what I like to do is give about 50 milliseconds of kick attack to punch through the bass guitar, so to speak. You can see it on the meter here. So that's just allowing the kick to have a little window of time to shine before the bass comes back and fills up that low end. It eliminates that competition of the low end between the bass and the kick, in my opinion. So let's hear the mix again with that signal chain in. So one more thing I like to do, I recommend other people to do it if they feel like there's just something lacking in the high end, even after everything they've done, is make a distortion bus. I put an EQ right up front. I know it's a little wacky looking, but the main point to get across is that I get rid of that low stuff when it enters this effects channel, because right after that is a distortion. In this case I use the Tube Screamer model and Pod Farm. But there's so many distortions out there. I recommend that you try all different kinds until you find a tone that you're really into. But anyways, when it hits this distortion, there's not low end coming with it. That could be really devastating to the tone if you're sending a lot of low end to something that's this driven. And then after that, I like to put a limiter on there, because I don't want this distortion to be dynamic in any way. I want it to be under my control. All you have to do is move the fader to get that exact amount of distortion and not worry about unpredictable amounts of distortion. So I'm going to go ahead and experiment with my level of that send until I get a tone that I like. So here's another song of mine called Dazed, and I use the same exact bass tone for this song, and I'll go ahead and play the mix with this as well. So yeah, same settings, and I feel that it tends to just fit right in with the guitars really well. It gets out of the way where it needs to, and it comes through where the guitars can't. And I feel that's a recipe for a great rock and metal bass sound. The difficult thing about bass guitar is that there's so many opinions on what makes it sound good, or what it needs to do in a mix. Especially in these styles, I feel like it can be buried and just serve as a low-end extension, but I think what's important to take away is that you can get a mid-range that can sit where the guitars are in a way, and almost add to the guitar's character, and not just serve as this low-end thing below the guitar spectrum. I hope this stuff was helpful, and I hope that there's some tips that were in this video that could be beneficial to you and your process. If you guys have any questions, or you want me to embellish on any of these topics a little bit further, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll happily get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks for watching, guys.